Welcome to a journey through time, to 18th century Barcelona, a city where the sound of the Mediterranean blended with the voices of dock workers, the creaking of wooden piers, the ringing of bells, and the dull echo of marching soldiers. Thanks to modern artificial intelligence technologies, we can now bring old engravings and paintings to life, transforming them into photorealistic scenes and seeing Barcelona as its residents knew it in the 18th century, without a romantic filter, but with a sense of genuine presence. Let's step into this era and begin our walk. In the early 1700s, Barcelona was one of the most important ports of the Western Mediterranean and home to around 40,000 people living within dense city walls between the sea and the surrounding hills. It was a city of merchants, sailors, craftsmen, and soldiers, a city that still remembered its former autonomy and was already beginning to adapt to the new reality of centralized power. Our journey begins where Barcelona met the sea. In the 18th century, the city was not separated from the water by wide boulevards or promenade embankments. The sea came almost right up to the buildings, and the shoreline was a mix of sand, wooden piers, and temporary docks. Early in the morning, fishing boats returned with their catch, nets heavy with fish and decks wet with salt water. Nearby stood merchant ships arriving from Marseille, Genoa, Naples, and other Mediterranean ports loaded with barrels of wine, olive oil, textiles, and wool. Larger vessels waited offshore, while smaller boats moved between them, transporting goods and people. The sea fed Barcelona, provided income and connected it to the outside world, but it also reminded the city of its dangers as enemy fleets could appear from the same direction. Near the shoreline rose the city walls and bastions, part of a complex defensive system that shaped Barcelona's appearance in the 18th century. The city was trapped between the sea and its fortifications, and any expansion required enormous effort. After the dramatic events of the early century, especially following the siege of 1714, defense became not only protection from external threats, but also a tool of control. The most powerful symbol of this was the Citadel, a massive fortress built by order of King Philip V. Hundreds of houses in the La Ribera district were demolished for its construction, forcing thousands of residents to leave their homes. For many Barcelonans, the citadel became a painful reminder of lost freedoms. From its bastions, soldiers could observe the city streets, and its cannons were aimed not so much toward the sea as inward at Barcelona itself. Leaving the fortifications behind, we moved deeper into the old city, into the dense, tangled world of the narrow streets of La Ribera. In the 18th century, this was one of Barcelona's most vibrant districts, where everyday life was in constant motion. Craftsmen and laborers lived here, with workshops located directly on the ground floors of their homes. In these cramped spaces, fabrics were woven, leather was processed, iron was forged, and tools were repaired. The streets were so narrow that the upper floors of buildings almost touched, blocking out sunlight. Even during the day, the area remained in semi-darkness, and at night, the city was lit only by a few oil lamps and light from windows. The smells were sharp and heavy. Smoke from hearths, damp stone, waste poured directly onto the streets. Yet, it was under these conditions that the city's economic wealth was created through the labor of people whose names rarely appeared in chronicles. Moving further on, we reached the church of Santa Maria del Mar, a majestic Gothic temple that in the 18th century remained the spiritual center of the coastal districts. Built in the 14th century with funds from merchants and sailors, it was seen as a church of ordinary townspeople rather than royal authority. Inside, its tall stone columns created a sense of stability and calm, something deeply needed in a city that had endured political upheaval. Here people prayed before long voyages, asked for protection from storms, and gave thanks for safe returns. In this space, the lives of those closely tied to the sea and trade intersected. From the church, our path leads to the Bourne district, one of the few relatively open spaces within the city walls. In the 18th century, this square served as a site for markets, public gatherings and official announcements. Grain, meat and wine were traded here, and royal decrees and news from Madrid were read aloud. On ordinary days, the square was noisy and chaotic, filled with carts, animals and people from all walks of life. After 1714, such spaces took on new significance, becoming stages for life under the new administration. Old Catalan traditions gradually gave way to centralized governance, a shift that was felt even in how city squares were used. Nearby were port markets and custom zones where goods from across the Mediterranean were inspected, weighed and taxed. Barcelona in the 18th century was not Europe's wealthiest city, but it remained an important trade hub through which significant flows of goods passed. Merchants closely followed political developments, knowing that any decision by the crown could affect trade privileges, duties, and routes. The city's economic life was tightly intertwined with politics, creating constant tension between local elites and central authority. Gradually, the dense construction of the old city began to thin, and we approached the outskirts of 18th century Barcelona. Here, houses gave way to gardens, vineyards, and military installations. Beyond the walls, life was calmer and almost rural, yet increasingly shaped by the needs of the state and the army. These areas served as a buffer between the city and the surrounding world, reminding residents that Barcelona remained a fortress, constrained by its walls and controlled from the outside. Despite destruction, displacement, and strict oversight, Barcelona continued to live. People kept working, trading, building, and preserving their customs. The city was not static. It constantly adapted to new conditions, balancing between the sea, craftsmanship, and power. The streets, markets, and buildings we have seen formed the foundation for changes that would come in the second half of the 18th century, leading Barcelona into a new historical phase. As we continue our walk through 18th century Barcelona, we dive deeper into the everyday life of the city, a life rarely depicted in ceremonial engravings, yet one that defined the rhythm of existence for tens of thousands of people. Behind the stone facades lay cramped inner courtyards where sunlight barely reached. Laundry was dried here, water barrels were stored, bird cages hung, and household tools were kept. Children played among puddles and trash, women washed clothes, and elderly residents spent hours in the shade, escaping the summer heat. In the 18th century, these courtyards were essential elements of urban life, serving as shared spaces amid extreme density. If you listened closely to the city early in the morning, you would hear it gradually waking up. With the first rays of sunlight, workshops opened, hammers struck, and looms creaked. Donkeys and mules pulled carts of goods to markets, while vendors shouted prices for fresh bread, vegetables, and fish. Water carriers hauled heavy barrels, supplying homes with water, as centralized plumbing did not yet exist and clean water was a constant concern. Most residents depended on wells and rainwater, and during dry months, shortages were especially severe. We approach buildings that in the 18th century played crucial social roles: hospitals, shelters, and monasteries. One such place was the Hospital of Santa Creu, a large medical institution that cared for the poor, the sick, and the wounded. In an era when medicine was only beginning to move beyond medieval concepts, treatment often consisted of care, prayer, and basic hygiene. Still, such institutions were vital to city life, especially during epidemics that regularly swept through Europe. Disease did not discriminate by social status, and fear of illness was part of everyday consciousness. Monasteries and religious orders also fulfilled functions far beyond spiritual life. They ran schools, orphanages, distributed food to the poor, and provided temporary shelter to those on the edge of survival. In 18th century Barcelona, religion was not only a matter of faith, but a key element of social infrastructure, particularly in the absence of a developed state welfare system. As the day progressed, the city grew louder and more crowded. Markets filled with people and smells blended into a heavy, almost tangible air. Representatives of all social classes could be seen, from wealthy merchants in neat clothing to day laborers seeking occasional work. Trade moved slowly, with bargaining and long conversations, as every coin mattered. For many families, buying food for the day was the main, and sometimes the only, priority. As the sun began to set, Barcelona gradually changed its appearance. The heat subsided, and people came out to enjoy the cooler air. Taverns and cafes lit their lamps, voices, laughter, and the smell of wine spilled into the streets. News, rumors, and political events were discussed, passed from mouth to mouth. Though open criticism of authority could be dangerous, conversations about taxes, obligations, and injustices grew more common, especially among craftsmen and traders. Nighttime Barcelona was a city of contrasts. Main streets were still lit by scattered lanterns, but most districts sank into darkness. Moving through narrow streets was unsafe, and many avoided going out unless necessary. City guards patrolled to maintain order, yet crime remained part of life in a major port. Still, night also offered a degree of freedom, moments when the city felt less controlled, and its inhabitants allowed themselves small liberties. Beyond the city walls, life followed a different rhythm. Fields, gardens, and small settlements supplied Barcelona with food. These rural areas were gradually drawn into the city's orbit, becoming part of its economic system. Farmers depended on urban markets, while the city relied on their harvests. The 18th century marked a time when this interdependence strengthened, laying the groundwork for future growth beyond the old walls. Yet the walls remained an impenetrable boundary. They limited expansion, intensified overcrowding, and worsened sanitary conditions. more voices began calling for change, though real transformation still seemed distant. 18th century Barcelona lived in a state of restrained tension between past and future, between tradition and inevitable transformation. And yet, it was during this period that the city's character was shaped. Barcelona learned to survive under constraints, adapt to external control, and find opportunities for development even within tight limits. The city preserved its connection to the sea, its craftsmanship, and an inner resilience that would carry it into the 19th century, ready for major change. The streets, courtyards, markets, and buildings we walked through today became the foundation for Barcelona's future transformation. In the next century, the walls would be torn down, the city would burst beyond its limits, and rapid growth would begin. But the roots of that expansion lie here, in the 18th century, in the everyday lives of ordinary people whose names history barely preserved. This was our journey through 18th century Barcelona, a city living between sea, craft, and power, a city of constraints and quiet forward motion. Write in the comments which city and which era you would like to see in our next journey, and perhaps it will come alive in our next video. As always, see you in the past.